Could the theology and the philosophy of a Puritan New England preacher really have something to bear on our current cultural climate? Well, George Marsden certainly thinks so, and that's what he talks about in An Infinite Fountain of Light. Let me tell you what I thought.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
Okay, I have here An Infinite Fountain of Light by George Marsden, brand new release from IVP Academics, so thanks as always to IVP for sending me a copy for review. Let me tell you my thoughts on the main idea, the research, the readability, and then my reaction to this book as a whole. Okay. So the main idea of this book is, it is an exploration, a little bit of an exploration of the biography of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, if you don't know, is a very famous, well-established Puritan New England preacher who was involved in some of the great awakenings of the 1700s before the Revolution, before the American Revolution. So George Marsden is an historical expert on Jonathan Edwards in particular, has written multiple biographies of him, and is kind of known as, just an expert on the life and the work of this figure. So this book draws on Marsden's deep expertise and actually is a very accessible, slim presentation of what George Marsden sees as important elements of Jonathan Edwards' thought that have some bearing and salience to our current cultural climate, especially the culture of modern religion, American religion, and American evangelicalism. So this is kind of George Marsden's, it kind of reads like an extended essay. It's very short, an extended essay of his thoughts on here's how I think Jonathan Edwards has some wisdom for us today in terms of our current religious practice, current religious culture as in American evangelicalism. That's kind of what An Infinite Fountain of Light is ultimately about. Specifically, he draws particularly on Edwards' theology of God's beauty and kind of Edwards' theology of conversion, and especially conversion as an affective, emotional experience. And some of Edwards' critiques of overly sensationalistic, overly maybe emotive conversion narratives, and some of that. So he brings some of that and more to bear on our current cultural climate. So that's the main idea. The research, not a lot to say on this. George Marsden is an extremely well-regarded historian for good reason. He's remarkably well-versed in both American evangelical and fundamentalistic history, American religious history, and specifically Jonathan Edwards. I mean, this is just his wheelhouse. Research is extremely good. He draws directly on primary writings from Jonathan Edwards, quotes them extensively where needed. Just no issues, no real warnings or concerns about the research when it comes to this book. And the readability is very high. I mentioned it's very short. It's 5 chapters. It does read a bit like an extended essay. But it's just very delightful. It's actually very delightful to read. I found it really engaging. There's a chapter that gets into Benjamin Franklin, actually, kind of surprising, who was kind of a contemporary of Jonathan Edwards, and his discussion of Franklin's contribution to the creation of American religious culture is super interesting and super readable and kind of a nice surprise. But overall, the book is short. It's very, very, very tightly written, very well presented, very accessibly written. Really enjoyed the style of this book. Okay, now my reaction to this. So I was interested in this book in particular because I have been interested in Jonathan Edwards as a figure for some time. I've known of multiple really respected scholars who in some ways consider Edwards the high watermark when it comes to Christian public intellectual efforts in America, which is really interesting and also a little bit tragic that the fact that if that's right, it's all been downhill from there. But I am personally not very familiar with Edwards. I know of the famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was kind of put off of Edwards as a figure because of that sermon. But I've since come around to being actually really interested in wanting to learn more about him. He's also infamously owned a couple slaves, which is frequently discussed in terms of the question of can he be legitimately learned from today. And I will say, it's just a little bit of a side note, Marsden does discuss that very topic very early in the book. He understands that's an issue when it comes to discussing Edwards. He discusses that topic. I think he does it very fairly, with a good bit of nuance, and he also points people to his long biography in which I haven't read it, but in which he apparently dives deeply into that topic and discusses it at great length. So know that that's at least addressed here. But all that to say, I've been kind of put off Edwards for various reasons, fairly or not. mostly not fairly, I would say. And I've come around to wanting to learn more about him, and I still don't know much about him, and so I was interested in this book because it is so slim and accessible, and because of its cultural angle in which he's trying to say, here's what Marston's trying to say, here's what Jonathan Edwards has to say about our current culture and our current religious culture specifically. And I have to say, this only increased my desire to learn more about Edwards. I loved this book. I really loved this book. And a big reason I loved it is because of its brevity and because of how incisive it is page for page. I mean, he really boils down some very clear arguments in a very, very short, readable style in a short package. And I just thought, in terms of, sentence for sentence, page for page worth, this book is like worth its weight in gold in that I find it so valuable and so insightful. Because Marsden is not only a scholar on Edwards, but he's also a very astute observer of our current religious climate, and he knows American evangelical and fundamentalistic history so well that he brings to bear very, very acute insights and also draws on Edwards in a powerful, beautiful way. He really, just this short book, shifted my own perception of Edwards away from the Sinners of the Angry God preacher to way more thoughtful and, dare I say, like kind of a beautiful expositor of theological and philosophical truths that I think are extraordinarily valuable for us. So that's pretty high praise for a book like this, I would say. Someone who doesn't know a lot about Edwards like me can enter this, get a ton out of it, and be really intrigued to learn a lot more as I am. So I wanted to post this review up here, particularly if you can relate to any of that experience or background. If you are not someone who knows a lot about Edwards, but you're interested in American religious history, and you're also interested in what could someone like an Edwards figure have to say about our current times, or you're interested in some of the controversies around him, like the sinners in the hands of an angry God theology, or the fact that he seemed like he was a slave owner. If you're interested in those controversies, then this book is astounding entry point for you, as it has been for me, and it's definitely set up my further desire to learn more about Edwards, the person that he was, and the way he contributed to American religious life and American history. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on George Marsden's excellent, wonderful book, An Infinite Fountain of Light, Jonathan Edwards for the 21st Century. As always, thanks for taking some time to watch.